The neighborhood was pristine. Rows of identical homes, trimmed hedges, and driveways that gleamed like showroom floors. For Jack and Sarah Mullins, it had been a deliberate choice. After years of service in the military, Jack longed for peace, routine, and a place where nothing unpredictable ever happened. The HOA promised order, promised safety. What it delivered was something else entirely. At first, the couple complied with every rule. They painted their shutters the approved shade of gray, attended the mandatory HOA meetings, and paid their dues on time. Sarah, warm and observant, began noticing how quickly violations were issued, for flowerbeds, flags, even how long a car sat parked. Still, they kept quiet. Jack had faced war zones. He thought this was peace. But as months passed, the rules began to feel like chains. Notices arrived for trivial things. A garden hose left out, a welcome mat too colorful. Jack laughed them off. Sarah didn't. She saw the pattern, how certain families, the elderly, the outspoken, were being singled out. It wasn't about order. It was about control. Sarah had always been composed, but never passive. After a year of silence, she finally stood up at an HOA meeting, surrounded by sharp suits and forced smiles. She calmly questioned a fine imposed on a single mother next door, a $250 charge for having a toddler's tricycle visible from the street. Her tone was respectful but firm. The room grew quiet. Eyes turned cold. She had crossed a line. One board member leaned forward and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "If you don't like the rules, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you." Jack tensed beside her. It was the same tone he'd heard from officers who abused their rank. Calm, polished, and dripping with threat. Sarah didn't flinch. "I thought this was a community," she replied, "not a dictatorship in disguise." After that night, something shifted. Inspections of their property became more frequent. A new fine arrived for yard clutter, a watering can left on the steps. Then came a warning about an unauthorized guest. Despite the fact that it was Sarah's sister, the message was clear: you spoke. Now you'll pay. It started with a knock. Not the polite kind, but a pounding that rattled the glass. Sarah opened the door to find two men in dark HOA polos, their stance rigid, eyes shielded behind tinted sunglasses. They weren't there to talk. They were there to send a message. "We're here to follow up on noncompliance," one said. "You've been warned enough." His tone was casual. His fists were not. Sarah stepped out, trying to remain calm. She held up her phone to record, but one of the men slapped it out of her hand. "You don't film us," he growled. When she demanded they leave, he shoved her. She stumbled, her arm hitting the porch rail. The second man moved to block her way inside. She tried to scream. That's when the first one struck her hard, across the face. Inside, Jack heard the thud, and a sound he had never heard before. Sarah's voice cracking in pain. Something inside him snapped. The man who had fought in deserts and jungles, who had held dying comrades in his arms, was no longer retired. He was activated. Jack burst through the front door like a thunderclap. The scene froze for a half-second. His wife bleeding, stunned, two strangers on their porch mid-motion. In that moment, Jack wasn't a homeowner. He wasn't a civilian. He was a trained Marine reacting to an open threat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hesitate. He simply moved. The first enforcer turned to swing again. Jack ducked, stepped inside his reach, and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. A clean, efficient strike that dropped him to the ground gasping. The second tried to grab Sarah's arm. Jack caught him mid-motion and locked his wrist with brutal precision. One twist, one cry of pain, a sharp crack as the man hit the deck face first. It was over in 15 seconds. Sarah was sobbing. Jack's hands trembled, but not from adrenaline. From the fear that he was too late. He cradled her gently, whispering, "You're safe now. No one touches you. Not while I'm breathing." The HOA enforcers moaned on the ground, broken and humiliated. But Jack didn't revel in it. He didn't even look at them. His war had never ended. It had simply changed arenas. Sirens echoed down the street within minutes. Blue and red lights painted the pristine white facades of the neighborhood. Officers rushed out of 2 patrol cars, hands on their weapons, shouting commands before assessing the scene. Jack stepped back, hands raised, blood on his shirt, but not his own. He pointed to Sarah, still shaking, and to the 2 men on the ground. "They attacked my wife," he said, but no one listened. One officer knelt beside the injured HOA enforcers, while another approached Jack cautiously. A neighbor, recording on their phone from a porch, could be heard whispering, "They're arresting the wrong guy." Jack complied with every instruction. He didn't resist. Still, they cuffed him roughly. "You're being detained for assault and battery," the officer said flatly. Sarah screamed, tried to explain, but they told her to stay back. Blood still ran from the cut above her brow. No one checked it. No paramedic offered help. The enforcers were loaded into ambulances like victims. Jack was shoved into the back of a cruiser like a criminal. In one moment, he had defended his home. In the next, he was its prisoner. The very next morning, a carefully worded email was sent to every resident of the community. It came from the HOA board, with the subject line, "Incident on Willow Ridge Lane HOA Statement." The message was clinical, calm, and utterly false. It described a violent outburst by a homeowner against authorized enforcement officers conducting a routine compliance check. They claimed Jack had assaulted 2 employees without provocation. Not a word was said about Sarah. Not about the push. Not about the punch. Not about the bruises on her arms or the cut on her forehead. The HOA called for unity and warned against the spread of misinformation. "Violence has no place in our community," the email read. The irony burned like acid. Some neighbors believed it. Others didn't. Whispers passed from yard to yard. Someone had heard screaming. Another had seen Sarah limping. But no one had seen the full story, yet. The HOA hoped to bury it fast, to move on, to let Jack become a silent example of what happened when residents fought back. What they didn't know was that the truth had been recorded. Sarah sat in the quiet of her living room, still shaken, her face bruised, her hands trembling. Jack was in a cell. The HOA had twisted the story. She felt powerless until she remembered the porch camera. Hidden behind a planter, it had recorded everything. The aggression, the slap, the fall, the blood. Every second. She uploaded the footage to her laptop with shaking fingers. She didn't add commentary. She didn't need to. The video spoke for itself. A single tweet from her niece read, "My uncle is a veteran. He defended his wife from HOA thugs. He's in jail. Watch this." Within an hour, it had 10,000 views. By nightfall, it had millions. News stations picked it up. Influencers reacted with rage. Veterans groups rallied behind Jack. The comments were an avalanche of fury and support. "This man is a hero. The HOA should be investigated. Free Jack Mullins." The narrative was no longer controlled by the HOA. It belonged to the public now, and the public wanted justice. The story swept across the country like wildfire. Morning news anchors replayed the video frame by frame, outraged. Commentators debated HOA overreach, veterans' rights, and systemic abuse in suburban governance. Jack's name trended across social media. His military record, decorated, disciplined, honorable, only intensified public fury. Veterans organizations issued official statements of support. Thousands of strangers donated to Sarah's newly created legal defense fund. Civil rights lawyers volunteered their time. Political figures began to weigh in, demanding investigations into the HOA's operations. What had started as a small act of self-defense became a national conversation. Outside the courthouse where Jack was being held, supporters began to gather. They brought signs that read, "Protect the Protector. HOA equals House of Abuse. Justice for Jack." Reporters camped outside the gates. Drones hovered over the neighborhood. And inside her home, Sarah sat by the window, holding her husband's medals in one hand and the arrest warrant in the other. The world finally cared. Now it was time for the court to listen. The courtroom was packed. Not just with legal teams and reporters, but with everyday people who had driven hours to witness the trial. Veterans in uniform sat shoulder to shoulder with suburban mothers and local students. Jack was led in, wrists bound in steel, yet his posture was calm. Not defiant, not broken, just ready. Sarah met his eyes. He nodded once. That was enough. The prosecutor painted a picture of Jack as a potentially unstable man with military training who used excessive force. He referenced the HOA's report and described Jack's actions as calculated violence. But every word fell flat. The jury shifted uncomfortably, because everyone in that room had already seen the video. Jack's defense attorney, a sharp but measured woman named Claire, rose slowly. She began by saying, "We are not here to debate the law. We are here to confront the truth." Then she played the footage on the courtroom screen. No edits, no voiceover, just raw footage. The slap, the fall, the blood, and Jack acting only when his wife was in danger. When the screen went black, the room sat in stunned silence. Day one had ended, but the tide had already turned. The room fell silent as Sarah walked to the witness stand. Her face still bore faint bruises, but her posture was steady, dignified. She swore the oath with a clear voice, then sat, hands folded tightly in her lap. For a moment, she looked out at the crowd. Then she turned toward the jury and began to speak. She described the morning in exact detail. The knock, the threats, the way her phone was slapped from her hand. She told them how it felt when the first blow hit her face. She paused, eyes welling but never spilling over. Then she said the words that cut through the courtroom like a blade. "They didn't come to enforce rules. They came to punish me for speaking up." When the prosecutor tried to suggest she had escalated the incident, Sarah didn't raise her voice. She simply looked him in the eye and said, "If asking questions is a threat, then what kind of system are we living in?" Even the judge looked moved. Sarah had not only defended her husband, she had shattered the mask of the HOA with nothing but the truth. One by one, neighbors came forward. People who had never spoken up before now filled the courtroom with a quiet, trembling resolve. A retired teacher testified that her flag had been forcibly removed from her porch for being too political. A young mother recounted being fined $500 for allowing her daughter to draw chalk on the sidewalk. The stories piled up, not about broken rules but about broken dignity. Then came the moment that shook the courtroom. An elderly man in a worn blazer, voice shaky but determined, stated under oath, "I saw them push her. I saw the fear in her eyes. I didn't help, and I've regretted it every day since." His confession wasn't just testimony. It was redemption. The gallery sat in silence. Some wept. The prosecutor tried to cast doubt on the credibility of the witnesses. But the defense didn't need to fight back. The jury had already begun to understand. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute. It was a pattern, culture, a quiet reign of fear. And Jack Mullins had simply been the first to say, "Enough." He entered the courtroom in a tailored suit and practiced smile, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. Richard Halberd, the HOA president, was not used to being questioned, only obeyed. But now, under oath, and under the weight of 1,000 online eyes, he was cornered. The defense attorney wasted no time. "Mr. Halberd, are HOA enforcers trained in conflict resolution?" He hesitated. "They're given general guidance." "Are they licensed security officers?" "No." "Did you approve the hiring of the 2 men who assaulted Mrs. Mullins?" A pause, a twitch of the jaw. "Yes." And in that pause, the courtroom heard the crack in the armor. Emails were shown. Ones in which Halberd encouraged aggressive enforcement of HOA regulations to maintain compliance through pressure. His voice faltered. The audience watched as the man who had once controlled the neighborhood found himself powerless under truth. By the end of the cross-examination, Richard Halberd no longer looked like a leader. He looked like a man who had mistaken power for purpose, and now stood naked in its collapse. Outside the courthouse, a forest of microphones bloomed each morning. Reporters lined the sidewalk, calling out questions to attorneys, neighbors, anyone willing to speak. Jack Mullins had become a household name, not as a criminal but as a man forced to fight twice. Once to protect his wife and now to defend his name. Every major network sent crews. National anchors flew in. Pundits debated the implications. HOA overreach, the rights of homeowners, the treatment of veterans. Sarah's testimony went viral again. Clips of her quiet resolve played on repeat. Late-night hosts turned the president of the HOA into a punchline. The case was no longer local, it was a mirror for the country. Jack, still in custody, watched from a small jail cell as strangers across the nation rallied to his side. Veterans groups held rallies. A petition demanding his immediate release gained over 2 million signatures. Hashtags like #JusticeForJack and #HOAReformNow trended daily. A courtroom had become a battleground. But outside, a movement was rising. And yet, Jack said little. He didn't need to speak. The world had seen enough. The truth was louder than anything he could ever say. The prosecution hoped to frame Jack as dangerous. But when the defense introduced his service record, the courtroom changed. It wasn't a list, it was a legacy. Jack Mullins had served in 3 combat zones. He'd been awarded 2 Bronze Stars. He'd led search and rescue operations under enemy fire. His file spoke louder than any accusation. This man was not reckless. He was trained, tested, and honorable. Photos were shown to the jury. Jack carrying wounded comrades, receiving medals, hugging orphans in villages abroad. But Claire, his attorney, didn't romanticize it. "This isn't to say he's perfect," she told them. "It's to show you that when Jack Mullins uses force, it's not because he's out of control. It's because he knows exactly what danger looks like and how to stop it." The prosecution tried to pivot, questioning whether combat experience made him more volatile. But it backfired. A decorated Marine colonel testified for the defense. "Men like Jack are the reason others come home alive. He's not a threat. He's a protector." And in that moment, the jury didn't just see a defendant. They saw a man who had served his country and was now being punished for protecting his home. By the 3rd week of trial, the prosecution was visibly strained. The public was no longer buying the official story. But the lead prosecutor pressed on, trying to reframe Jack as a man with a hero complex, someone who overreacted in civilian life due to unresolved trauma. He presented psychological evaluations from generic sources and referenced military cases that had nothing to do with Jack. Claire rose calmly to object. "The prosecution is on trial now," she said. "Not my client's service." She reminded the court that Jack hadn't attacked. He had responded in proportion under duress to protect his wife. The jury took notes, eyes narrowing every time the prosecutor danced around the facts. Then came a final, desperate play. The prosecutor accused Sarah of exaggerating her injuries. He suggested that emotions had clouded judgment, and maybe the HOA enforcers hadn't hit her at all. The courtroom gasped. It was a mistake. Claire stood, walked to the evidence screen, and replayed the video. The moment of impact. Sarah's cry. Her fall. The blood. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The truth was already burned into their memory. The prosecutor sat down, visibly defeated. The more they twisted the story, the clearer it became. Claire's voice was calm, but every word struck like a scalpel. She didn't just defend Jack. She dismantled the machine that targeted him. She introduced emails, internal memos, and whistleblower statements from former HOA staff. What emerged was a chilling reality. Jack and Sarah weren't the first. They were just the first to fight back. One memo instructed enforcers to escalate non-compliance visits when resistance is noted. Another referred to residents who challenged the board as priority targets. The jury shifted in their seats. The judge leaned forward. Claire laid out a timeline of coordinated harassment, fines, threats, selective enforcement, all pointing back to HOA leadership. Witnesses testified that HOA board members had incentivized aggressive behavior by their enforcers, offering bonuses for citations and intimidation tactics that resulted in resident conformity. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't about rules. It was about control through fear. Claire ended the day with one final sentence. My client didn't just defend his wife. He stood between a corrupt system and the people it preyed on. And with that, the courtroom didn't just see a defense. They saw an awakening. After the courtroom revelations, the dam broke. People who had once stayed silent began to speak. And not just in court. Emails flooded the defense team. Letters were hand-delivered to the courthouse. Local residents came forward, sharing stories that echoed Sarah and Jack's experience, each more disturbing than the last. A widowed father testified that his son's wheelchair ramp had been deemed aesthetic pollution. Another neighbor, a nurse, shared how her late-night shifts earned her noise complaints and threats of eviction. A young couple had been fined for hanging a baby swing from a tree. Each account unveiled a community policed not by fairness, but by fear. One story, in particular, stunned the court. A woman revealed she had filed multiple complaints against the same enforcers who struck Sarah. The HOA had ignored her. In fact, she had been fined for making false accusations. The irony burned in the jurors' faces. Claire stood back and let their voices fill the room. This was no longer about one man defending his wife. It had become a reckoning, a revolt, a long overdue purge of silence. Judge Marion Fields had presided over hundreds of cases. She'd seen theatrics, posturing, courtroom games. But this was different. Day after day, she sat stone-faced, listening. Not just to arguments, but to cries beneath the surface. Her gavel didn't come down often, but when it did, it silenced entire rows. And behind her quiet demeanor, something stirred. A deep sense of moral weight. She watched the prosecution unravel, not because of poor preparation, but because the truth, undeniable and raw, was rising like a tide. She saw Sarah's pain. She saw Jack's restraint. She heard every neighbor who once trembled now speak with fire in their throat. This wasn't just a legal trial. It was a human one. In one notable moment, the HOA's attorney objected to an emotional witness statement. Judge Fields overruled, stating, "This court will not silence truth simply because it's inconvenient to power." Her words echoed through the chamber like a quiet earthquake. She took notes. She rewatched the video footage. She requested HOA bylaws herself. And most importantly, she listened. And in that, she became not just a judge of law, but a guardian of justice. Just when the case seemed headed toward a clear conclusion, the defense received an anonymous message. It contained a name, a date, and a clip of security footage, different from Sarah's porch camera. The sender? Unknown. The source? A neighboring house. But what it showed changed everything. The footage revealed the HOA enforcers earlier that day, laughing in the driveway of their truck. One of them mimicked a slap, mocking Sarah. The other said, "Let's shut her up this time. She's making us look weak." The jury wasn't supposed to see that side of them, arrogant, calculated, predatory. But now it was undeniable. The prosecution tried to dismiss it as irrelevant, locker room banter. But Judge Fields overruled. The clip was played in full. Silence followed. The room no longer saw a scuffle. It saw a premeditated act. Jack hadn't overreacted. He'd interrupted something far darker. And then, in a final blow, one of the former HOA enforcers, sitting in court for support, stood up, unprompted, and asked to speak. "I was told to go after them," he said. "We were rewarded for cracking down." A gasp swept the courtroom. The case had just turned from defense to exposure. The courtroom was silent, oppressively so. Hours passed as the jury deliberated. Reporters waited outside in hushed anticipation. Protesters clutched signs with prayers and fury painted across cardboard. Inside, Jack sat beside his attorney, hands folded, face calm. Sarah held his hand with both of hers, fingers trembling. This moment would either free them or crush them. When the jury filed back in, eyes downcast, no one could read the outcome. The foreman rose, clearing his throat. In the matter of Jack Mullins versus the state, he looked directly at the judge. "We find the defendant not guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Not with cheers, but with the breathless gasp of relief. Jack closed his eyes. Sarah broke into tears. Claire placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Judge Fields offered no smile, no nod, only quiet affirmation. Justice had spoken. Outside, the crowd roared. Cameras flashed. News tickers rolled the headline across every screen in America. But Jack didn't rush to celebrate. He embraced Sarah, then turned to the courthouse steps with the same stillness he carried into combat. He hadn't fought for revenge. He'd fought for dignity, and finally it had been returned. Jack stepped out of the courthouse into blinding sunlight and a crowd that surged toward him. Not in anger, but in awe. Some clapped. Others wept. A veteran in uniform saluted him from the front row of the barricade. But Jack didn't raise his fists. He didn't smile for the cameras. He simply stood there, as if anchoring himself to the earth after weeks of drifting through chaos. To the public, he was a symbol, the man who had stood his ground against corruption. But to Jack, the word innocent felt both accurate and incomplete. He hadn't asked to be a hero. He had just wanted peace. He held Sarah close, whispering words the microphones couldn't catch. She nodded, eyes wet, hands clenched around his. A reporter shouted, "What will you do next?" Another asked, "Any message for the HOA?" Jack didn't respond, but Claire did. "My client has been declared innocent in a court of law and the court of public opinion. That's enough." But for Jack, innocence was more than a verdict. It was a return to self, earned, scarred, and unshakably his. When Jack and Sarah returned to their house, everything looked the same. The trimmed lawn, the gray shutters, the porch where it all began. But as they stepped inside, the air felt different. Heavier, quieter. A place meant for peace had become a memory of war. Even the smallest sounds, a door creaking, a car passing, carried echoes of the confrontation that changed everything. Neighbors waved from a distance, some with guilt in their eyes, others with respect. A few brought pies, casseroles, handwritten notes. Jack appreciated the gestures but kept his circle small. He wasn't bitter, just cautious. Once, this had been his refuge. Now, it was a battlefield he still walked through in his mind. Sarah tried to resume routines. She watered the plants, refilled the bird feeder, restocked the pantry. But she too moved differently. She locked the doors more often. She avoided the HOA building. The bruises on her face had faded, but the ones beneath lingered. They no longer lived in fear, but neither did they live in forgetfulness. Their home was no longer just four walls. It was a monument to pain, to truth, and to the price of standing tall. A week after the verdict, the HOA board called a press conference. They stood before a podium set up awkwardly in front of their office building, with carefully arranged flags and a banner reading "Community First." The president, Richard Halberd, now stripped of his smug confidence, read from a prepared statement. "We extend our deepest regrets to Mr. and Mrs. Mullins for the misunderstanding and distress caused." The word apology was used but not admitted. Not once did they acknowledge wrongdoing, corruption, or the violence itself. It was all carefully crafted language. Incident, miscommunication, misinterpretation of enforcement duties. To many, it sounded less like remorse and more like damage control. When asked if any board members would resign, Halberd dodged. When pressed on whether the enforcers were trained, he stammered, "We're reviewing our policies." Claire watched the live stream and shook her head. "This isn't an apology. This is a PR operation." Sarah didn't say a word. She simply closed her laptop. Some wounds don't need speeches to heal. They need accountability. And Jack? He never attended the press conference. Some truths don't need cameras. They just need change. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the foundation of the HOA began to fracture. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak now flooded meetings with questions, demands, and calls for resignations. The once intimidating boardroom, filled with polished wood and gavel taps, now echoed with voices of revolt. The people no longer feared the rules, they challenged them. One by one, board members stepped down. Some cited personal reasons, others claimed health concerns. But everyone knew the truth. They were fleeing accountability. Documents began leaking, expense reports, secret bonuses, private messages full of intimidation tactics. A group of residents formed a reform committee, and a petition was circulated. Disband the current HOA and rebuild from the ground up. The enforcers who had assaulted Sarah were officially terminated and placed under investigation. Civil suits were filed. Journalists kept digging, exposing a system built not on community, but control. The HOA, once untouchable, had become a symbol of excess and abuse, and it was crumbling under its own weight. From their porch, Jack and Sarah watched the fall unfold. Not with joy, but with quiet satisfaction. Justice hadn't ended in the courtroom. It was just beginning in their neighborhood. Jack's trial had become more than a local controversy. It had sparked a national reckoning. Across the country, communities began scrutinizing their own homeowners' associations. Residents who had once stayed silent about excessive fines, harassment, or discriminatory enforcement now had a banner to rally behind. #WeAreJack. States began reviewing HOA regulations. News segments investigated HOA abuses long hidden behind gated walls and bylaws. A senator introduced a bill called the Homeowners' Bill of Rights, which aimed to establish federal oversight and accountability for HOAs. Advocacy groups formed overnight. Veterans, elderly residents, single mothers, all demanding reform. Town halls filled. Boards resigned. Petitions circulated. Some HOAs resisted. Others began implementing transparent policies voluntarily. The phrase, "we're just following the rules," was no longer enough to justify silence or cruelty. Jack's case had exposed the system, but now others were tearing it down brick by brick. In the midst of it all, Jack and Sarah stayed quiet. They received thousands of letters, invitations to speak, even offers to write a book. But for now, they remained home, tending the garden, walking the dog, living simply. Because sometimes, real revolution starts by protecting just one home and letting the world learn from it. Jack never wanted a spotlight. He didn't crave applause, interviews, or headlines. But the world kept calling. Emails flooded in from fellow veterans who'd faced injustice. News stations offered primetime specials. Advocacy groups begged him to speak at national events. He was no longer just Jack Mullins. He was the face of a movement. At first, he refused. "I didn't ask for this," he told Sarah. "I just protected my wife." But one night, a letter arrived from a teenage boy whose family had been evicted by their HOA over a flag on their porch. It read, "I didn't know it was okay to fight back until I saw you." Jack sat quietly for a long time. The next morning, he agreed to his first public appearance. He didn't deliver grand speeches. He didn't make political statements. He simply told the truth. What happened, why he acted, and what others should never be afraid to do. And people listened, not because he shouted, but because he had lived it. Jack never sought to become a leader. But sometimes, leadership is thrust upon the shoulders of those who stood up when no one else would. After the trial, offers poured in: book deals, documentaries, merchandise, speaking tours. Some wanted to call it the HOA war. Others pitched reality shows or scripted dramas. The money was staggering. Agents promised six-figure advances. One network offered to fly Jack and Sarah to New York for an exclusive special. But Jack said the same thing to every one of them. "This isn't a brand. It's a wound." He refused to let his pain become entertainment. He told Sarah, "The moment we sell the story, we lose the meaning." Sarah agreed. They didn't survive that trial to become celebrities. They survived it to stay free, to live without fear, and to give others the courage to do the same. Instead of taking deals, Jack redirected media attention to real change. He partnered with veteran legal aid groups and helped fund the legal fees of others fighting HOA corruption. He appeared in community meetings, not for applause, but to listen, to be present, to remind people that they weren't alone. Because for Jack, the fight had never been about money. It had been about dignity, and that, he believed, should never be for sale. In the beginning, Sarah had simply wanted peace, to garden, to volunteer at the library, to build a home with Jack. But the day she stood on that porch, bruised and shaking, something inside her shifted forever. She had been a victim once. Now she was something else entirely, a survivor with something to say. It began with one interview, soft-spoken, vulnerable, but unwavering. Then came invitations to speak at women's advocacy panels, HOA reform forums, and veteran spouse support groups. And Sarah went, not to relive her trauma, but to reclaim it. She spoke of fear, of silence, of the loneliness that came from speaking up in a world that punished truth. But most of all, she spoke of courage. Don't wait for someone to save you, she told one crowd. Sometimes the person who needs to stand up is already looking back at you in the mirror. Her words resonated, calm, clear, and brave. She became a symbol not just of what had happened, but of what was possible after. Sarah never planned to be an advocate, but when the world tried to break her, she found her power in the pieces and gave it to others. Jack and Sarah could have disappeared. They had every reason to retreat from the world and live quietly. But instead, they chose something far more courageous. They stayed and they taught. Not from classrooms or podiums, but from their experience, from scars that had healed into lessons. They started hosting free community workshops, not only about HOA rights, but about standing up to intimidation, recognizing coercion, and reclaiming voice. Sarah led sessions on emotional resilience and advocacy for women. Jack taught de-escalation tactics, legal literacy, and veterans' rights in civilian life. Their porch, once a site of trauma, became a symbol of strength and solidarity. People came from neighboring counties just to sit in their backyard, ask questions, and hear the story directly from them. Not the internet, not the media, but from the ones who lived it. And they never charged a cent. They believed knowledge shouldn't be reserved for the privileged. It should be offered freely, to protect the next family who might stand where they once stood. They had once been targets. Now they were teachers. And in doing so, they rewrote not just their legacy but the rules of their community. It began with a vote. After months of hearings, protests, lawsuits, and resignations, the residents of Willow Ridge gathered in the town hall. This time, there were no threats, no intimidation, only paper ballots and quiet determination. On the table was a proposal: dissolve the existing HOA and replace it with a community-elected council, fully transparent and accountable. The measure passed by a landslide. On the day the HOA officially ceased to exist, Jack and Sarah didn't stand at the front. They sat in the back row, hand in hand, watching a neighborhood they had once feared rediscover its voice. Children played outside. People smiled without suspicion. Fences weren't just physical, they were emotional, and they were finally coming down. The new council invited Jack to speak. He declined, but Sarah stepped forward. Her voice was steady. "We didn't fight to be in charge," she said. "We fought so no one would ever be afraid to live here again." The room stood in applause. Not because they had won, but because they had healed. And that street, once silent under the weight of fear, finally breathed freely. Not just because the HOA was gone, but because the people had reclaimed their power.